Well, you know, don't commit crime, and then you won't end up in court. I mean, that is akin to saying we no longer believe in innocent until proven guilty, that every person that's in a courtroom is already guilty on that basis. I mean, that would be preposterous. It'd be horrendous to do that. North Korea might do that. The United Kingdom aren't supposed to do that. But that rather kind of goes to the nub of one of the issues on this, and there are many to it. But in particular, the idea that you are tried by 12 men and women, your peers, as it were, as distinct from a judge whose job it isn't to define guilt, but his job is to preside over the proceedings and to make sure that everything on both sides is crystal clear, adhering to the book, and the 12 people watching the case have all the information they need to make up their mind. I'm putting it rather crudely, but that's more or less what it's about. So this goes right to the heart, this idea of scrapping 95% of jury trials. And of course, it's been around since Norman times. David Lammy, of course, is the man whose name is on the tin on this one. It's rather interesting that David Lammy is now the Justice Secretary, and he's advancing, it looks as if he's advancing this particular policy, because whilst he's saying it's about cutting backlogs, he hasn't always had this view. It's worth a reminder of what David Lammy was saying about juries just a few years ago. Here it is.
The jury system is fundamental to our constitutional arrangement. We should not use the coronavirus as a cover to abandon juries, which is the opportunity to be judged by 12 of your peers. Juries being replaced by judges and magistrates is effectively the establishment, rather than your peers who live in your community deciding what justice should be.
And now he is the establishment, and he's changed his mind, by all accounts. Let's speak with Chris Daw KC, barrister, writer and broadcaster. Afternoon to you, Chris.
Good afternoon, Ian.
I mean, I already had a rough idea what your view might be on this, and I think you probably, it's a view you would share, I think, with barristers, defence barristers, prosecutors across the board, really. I mean, this is really put the cat among the pigeons.
It's quite extraordinary, isn't it, that a government that doesn't mention this in its manifesto at all, because frankly, who would have voted for them if they had? But they didn't mention it in their manifesto. And as you rightly pointed out, this is something that goes back around 1,000 years in one form or another. Of course, it's changed a lot over the years, but it goes back 1,000 years, and there are very many reasons why it's important. And perhaps your listeners and viewers may be interested in one particular story to kind of illustrate the importance of having juries to decide very difficult cases with emotion and morality involved, and kind of very challenging circumstances. So you'll remember probably a few years back, there was a gentleman called Stephen Owen, and he had a son called Darren who was 12. And Darren was run over and killed by a man called Kevin Taylor. Now, this was some years ago, and Kevin Taylor was a lorry driver, and he'd never passed a driving test, and he'd had numerous traffic convictions, and he ran over and killed Darren Owen when he was aged just 12. Taylor was prosecuted for dangerous driving or causing death by reckless driving, and he only got 18 months. And after his release, he drove past the family home and vandalised the boy's grave. Yeah. Now, this unsurprisingly upset the father of this young boy, Stephen Owen, and he took it upon himself to take a shotgun and go and find Taylor in an alleyway and shoot him with a shotgun. Now, unsurprisingly, he was charged with attempted murder, and he was tried before a jury. And that jury heard all of the circumstances. They heard how this man had been shameless in his reaction to killing a 12-year-old boy, how he had provoked and deliberately antagonized the family of this young boy. And the jury in that case listened very carefully to the arguments on both sides. They listened to the defence putting the extreme emotional provocation that the father had suffered as a result of not only the death of his son, but the deliberate behaviour of Kevin Taylor after his son's death. And the jury found him not guilty of all charges.
Wow.
Now, some of your viewers and listeners might say, well, that's wrong, isn't it? Because he clearly committed the crime. But others might be saying to themselves, well, a jury can be trusted to get it right. Even when the law might say one thing on the page, juries are not just there to apply the law like AI or a robot or even a judge. They are there to apply the law of the land as they see it, as custodians of the morality and of the history and of the principles and the values of our society, even when those principles and those values may conflict with what the law says. And we have had that in our country for 1,000 years as a bastion against tyranny, the tyranny of judges' courts, the tyranny of the king's courts as they used to be, with no input from the public and no account of what people on the streets think is right and wrong. It is for these reasons that the jury system is so important. The minute you go down the slope of abolishing juries purely for financial reasons and because of utter mismanagement of the court system for decades, then you're starting to destroy one of the most important things that makes us British, which makes this country what it is. Why is it, as I say in every jury speech I make, why is it that the jury system has been exported all over the world, not everywhere, but to many countries, and it has been retained? It's a constitutional right in the United States. It is a constitutional right in Canada. And here, the country which invented the jury system, which has sustained it, and which has, and let's be honest, Ian, what other public institution in our society has the same level of public support and approval as the jury system? If you can find me a single example of anything that commands the same level of public support, then I'll give up, Ian. But there's nothing. You ask ordinary members of the public, what do you think? Is it fairer to be tried by 12 ordinary people or by a judge who may have prejudices, who come from a very specific background, who doesn't necessarily have all of the common sense and the everyday experiences of life, such as having your son run over by a disgusting human being and the emotional reaction that they may provoke? That's why we need juries. And we need juries because ordinary people, and that includes you and me, I'm not talking about any specific kind of person, because juries are amazing. They are so diverse. You can have a millionaire on a jury, you can have a bin man on a jury, you can have anyone on a jury, and that's the whole point. They bring together the wisdom of an entire society in microcosm, in a room, and they return verdicts based not only on the law, which they must of course apply, but on their consciences. And the minute you remove that from the system, you may as well use a computer to decide verdicts, because that's how valid I consider that they would be.
I mean, that's a brilliant, almost monologue. I say that in a positive way, Chris, and your passion is, loud and clear on this. What is your reading of judges and what they would think of this? Because I would imagine there's, judges are also lawyers. There'd be quite a lot of judges who go, I don't want to do this. This is not my job as a judge. What's the divide like on that, do you
Let's put it this way, Ian. Firstly, judges, of course, are not allowed to comment on things publicly like this. But let's look at a couple of things that we do know. When the Criminal Bar Association asked us criminal barristers what we thought of this idea, the return was over 90% against scrapping juries in the way that's been proposed. I have no idea who the few percent left were that agreed with it, but they're certainly outliers when you think about those statistics. Now, when you think that the vast majority of judges are drawn from exactly that same pool of criminal barristers and of course some criminal solicitors as well, but the vast majority come from that same pool, it would be quite extraordinary if on the journey between barrister and judge they suddenly ditched all of those views and decided that they wanted to try cases on their own. My knowledge of what judges are saying about this, and some of them have said this not quite entirely publicly, but with a as it were a nod to their viewpoint, the vast majority, in fact, of judges are totally opposed to this because they know it's not necessary. It's not necessary because all we actually need to do is two things. One, stop clogging up the courts with really silly cases, for example, people being prosecuted for what they said on Twitter or whatever other nonsense that suddenly become flavour of the month amongst policing and prosecutors. So get rid of all that rubbish out of the court system. It's not even real crimes anyway. And secondly, just repair all the buildings and get all the courts actually sitting, because at the moment, a huge number of courts are not operating, 20-25% sometimes on any given day, not operating because the ceiling's fallen in,
yeah,
or the air conditioning, or the heating.
It's a bit rubbish, that, isn't it?
The toilets don't work.
It's not because we haven't got capability, it's because the buildings are in a state of disrepair.
In a state of disrepair, and because of massive underfunding in terms of making sure there are sufficient judges available to sit, making sure that we have all of the facilities needed to deal with cases, but also making choices. We've chosen to prosecute more and more people. We've chosen to make sentences longer and longer, and as a consequence, the courts are more and more clogged up. So maybe we need a bigger picture idea than simply saying to ourselves, well, one way to do it is just whiz all the cases through quickly, let judges lock everybody up as quickly as possible, get people pleading guilty because they're frightened of what the judge will do. That's what this is all about. It's about bringing economic incompetence and political incompetence to bear on a problem and replacing it by destroying our entire constitutional structure that's existed for 1,000 years. In my view, this is not going to happen, actually, because I've already, you know, if you read what's coming out of number 10, effectively, Keir Starmer's realised that this is going to be a monumentally unpopular policy. That if you pick one thing to attack that the general public will stand against you on, I suggest it's the jury system. Yeah. I genuinely don't think there's anything else.
I think that's left, right, rich, poor, black, white, whatever. Everybody unanimously pretty much goes, that's a fantastic system. Although, how do we answer this question, Chris? There are countries around the world that don't always have the jury system. How do they function? Because I'm sure some of those places they would argue actually our justice is very good and we don't always have juries.
There's a straightforward answer to that, and you're right that the Roman law system, which is in place in most of Europe, certainly in France and Italy and other countries, does not largely have juries. That largely has either one or more judges, professional judges. The difference is that they too have thousands of years of history, and they have built into their systems a whole range of safeguards, such as, for example, the right to an automatic retrial. If you're found guilty, you can have a whole nother trial as an appeal. Now, what's being proposed here is not to replace the jury system with some other safeguards, but just to scrap it all together. And that, in effect, I mean, the idea that you keep it for this 5% of, what's the difference? What's the difference? If you're charged with fraud and you could go to prison for 15 years, why is that somehow not a jury case? But if you're charged with rape and you could go to prison for 6 years, it is a jury case. I mean, it doesn't make any sense that you distinguish. You either say on principle, for serious crimes where you're looking at serious jail time, a jury should be the ultimate fact finder, or you say scrap the lot, get rid of them completely. And if you do that, and if you're honest enough to say we're going to get rid of it just to save money in the short term, I think you'd find that the public, not only lawyers, but the public would be out on the streets protesting against this. And I certainly have already said I would not accept a case in one of these courts, these trumped up non-jury courts that they're proposing to invent. I wouldn't do a case there. And not only that, I would go and stand outside on a picket line for as long as it took to bring the jury back.
Yeah, I mean, there's some real earned and experienced passion in everything you're saying there, Chris. I do also agree that I don't think this will see the light of day. We know that governments do have a habit of sort of testing, a bit of a litmus test, see what the reaction is. And the reaction has been pretty much everything you're saying. In fact, I'm not sure I've heard anybody come out with a sort of cohesive and very robust and even passionate argument to suggest that this would be a good way forward. And as you rightly say, and God, a 10-year-old could work this out. If you were scrapping the jury system due to some sort of philosophical moment of a revelation that you've had, wow, there is a better way, then maybe you could listen to that argument and debate it. But this isn't what this has been about. This is about how do we speed up the system, get rid of the very centerpiece of our justice structure, and that would be crazy. But of course, it probably won't happen now, and that's arguably a good thing. In terms of the jury system as it is, we've spoken about this before, Chris. There are some cases, and I know you've worked on some pretty lengthy financial cases before. I was speaking to another barrister quite recently, oddly, I think worked on it with you. But anyway, he was, that issue around juries being able to digest the enormity and the complexity when, even a barrister will sometimes say, blimey, I couldn't follow what was going on there. It was hard enough for me and it's my job. Are there certain areas of the jury system where it seems ridiculous if you're going to have to sit for 8 months on a very, very complex and intricate issue around, I don't know, international VAT fraud or something?
Well, you make a very good point, but the answer is that the jury is absolutely capable of dealing with the fundamental issues in those cases. And the problem is not the jury system, once again. The problem is the increasing use of overly complex evidence and overly complex charges and far too much, millions of pages of digital material, etc., etc. Every fraud case I've ever done comes down to one pretty fundamental and straightforward proposition. Someone has either lied or deceived or been dishonest at some point in order to secure money or something else from someone else. And it's as simple as that. And juries well understand that. They know when they're judging dishonesty and lies and intent. These are all everyday common concepts. So you make a very good point. Our courts are currently clogged up with fraud and other long and complex cases, drugs, conspiracy, etc., which are taking 4, 5, 6 months, sometimes 18 months to finish. That's a problem with the way the cases are structured and prosecuted. It's not a problem with the juries that are there to try and make sense of it. If you pile a load of completely irrelevant and extraneous information onto the jury, yes, you strain the system, but that's not their fault. That's our fault as lawyers. That's the fault of those who choose the number of witnesses to call, the amount of evidence to use. In most cases, you can establish that someone's committed a fraud by charging 2 or 3 straightforward crimes of saying, well, on this occasion, you sent an email, it was clearly a lie, it was designed to get 100 million from someone, you're guilty of fraud, or you're not guilty because maybe the jury discerned it wasn't dishonest, that maybe there was some innocent explanation. But make it simple, make cases as simple as you can instead of defaulting to make them as complicated as you can, and you will stamp out all of these ludicrously long, overextended and pointlessly complex cases which are currently clogging up our system.
Great stuff. Brilliant, Chris. Thank you for being on with us. Chris Daw KC, barrister, writer and broadcaster, getting right to the heart of that. And he didn't hold back. I think that represents the views of pretty much everybody. Or does it? Because I'm going to throw that out to you as well. 0344 499